going on, everybody? I'm Jerome Moore, and welcome to the Scene Podcast. I'm your host, and I'm with my co-host, the editor-in-chief of the Nashville Scene, Patrick Rogers, DPR.
That's right.
You know, which is a lot cooler, I think, than just Patrick Rogers, so I'm going to go with DPR.
Thank you. I like that.
Yeah.
I won't compare myself to any other people with initials. Yes, Jerome, thank you for having us. Episode 1.
The first one.
Excited to dive in.
For sure.
Each week we're going to kind of go through primarily what's in the issue that week. Maybe not always the cover story, but we're definitely going to start out this week talking about what's our cover story. Mm-hmm. And I'm very excited to have our contributor, Nicole Williams, with us, a.k.a. On First Readings Startles Easily, who writes a Metro Council column for us. Hello, Nicole.
Hi, Patrick. Hi, Jerome. I'm very excited to be here. I will point out to anyone watching this, I know we're in an audio medium, but against my better judgment, I have agreed to appear on camera, and I would have dressed maybe a little differently, but
you're fine.
We're rolling with it. We're rolling with it.
It wasn't
fantastic.
It wasn't my fault. It was DPR over here.
Oh, I would never blame you.
Yeah, just give the credit to the perpetrator.
Yeah.
Okay, I see how this thing's going to go. That's why I'm in the middle. Well, Nicole, thank you for coming very much. We're excited to talk about your cover story this week, which is all about neighborhood associations and their impact on development in Nashville. Right. It's a story you pitched to me a while ago now, and the timing just lined up really well because there's a push for rezoning in Nashville, and it all just sort of fits together really well. So what made you want to write this cover for us?
Well, I have sort of mixed feelings about neighborhood associations, and I knew that we were going to be talking about this as a city, about zoning reform, and I knew that neighborhood associations were going to be a big part of that conversation, and I just thought this would be a really interesting thing to write. I mean, I remember pitching it to you, Patrick. I think it was back in November. And I just thought, this would be cool. I could talk about the influence that neighborhood associations have on Nashville's development. And Patrick, you were like, oh, that sounds like a cover. So that's how we got to where we are today. And I'm super excited to be here and talk about it.
Yeah, editors love doing that. I warn people not to pop into my office and just talk about an idea they have because they'll walk out with an assignment. So,
but I like the title, Gatekeeping, the neighborhood.
Yeah,
because that speaks out to me, especially as a community. I don't really like homeowner associations either, HOAs or any of those things either. Are they gatekeeping or what's going on? So that really popped out to me.
I had a different idea for what we call a hammerhead, the short headline. I think I want to go with keeping up with the neighbors, which is kind of a fun one, but you had this idea, and I think it really speaks to the framing of the story really well.
Yeah.
If you want to kind of explain to us sort of, I think you lead off with a really good story about a specific neighborhood association and what they did. You mind kind of talking about that one to us?
Sure, I'd love to. So my intro to the whole piece is about this proposed development in Neely's Bend, which is, it's in the Madison area. It's a little more rural. Davidson County is 500 some odd square miles. And so we do have rural areas. We've got urban areas. But this one is a little more rural. And there was a proposal to build a 29-home subdivision. So not anything crazy. But the neighborhood association in Neely's Bend got very upset about this proposal. So they all showed up to a planning commission meeting to speak out against it. And they were wearing matching T-shirts. And I always joke that, when the matching T-shirts show up, your proposal is dead in the water, you're done.
It's serious when everybody got on matching.
Yeah, exactly.
You got a screen printer and all.
Right. Their shirts said, Narnia, Utopia, Shangri-La, Paradise, Save Neely's Bend.
Wow.
Which I thought was just really sort of fascinating. And the way that I tied this into the story, the overall piece, is that this development or this proposal met all of the requirements that they were supposed to meet through the city's guidelines. And the Planning Commission was swayed by this group of neighbors who showed up and said, we really don't want this. We feel like it's going to ruin our quality of life. It's going to destroy the character. And so the Planning Commission unanimously rejected the proposal.
Wow.
And I thought that was a really good sort of
That's organizing.
Yeah,
right?
an
That's,
example of
yeah.
how a neighborhood group can
Yeah.
make a big difference in sort of what happens in their neighborhood development-wise.
So question, like being a community organizer, right? That's what I would frame that as, like a body of people from a community said, hey, we want to come together and prevent this action from happening that we feel will be detrimental to our community. Does that happen often? Is that something that you've seen during the cover story? Like, you have that happening often here in Nashville, or is that kind of the latter? Is that rare?
No, it happens a lot.
Okay.
I think we see a lot of instances where neighborhood associations in particular, because they're some of the most well-organized neighborhood groups and they're really specific to specific neighborhoods, we see a lot of instances where they will show up in force to the planning commission or to the council and say, we don't like this because XYZ. And either the proposal might get defeated or it might have to change substantially to sort of meet the demands of the neighborhood association.
Yeah.
You know, a term that you mentioned that comes up a lot in this, quality of life.
Yeah.
There's like neighborhood associations are always like, this is going to impact our quality of life.
Yeah.
But there's also some irony there because, you know, often it's about, you know, a development that's going to add housing density, and housing density makes housing more affordable. One would say that's a pretty major part of quality of life.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think some people would agree with you and some people would not. But one thing I did see a lot of is this idea of people were able to buy into neighborhoods when it was affordable, and they're sort of pulling up the ladder behind them. And I'm not like a free market libertarian, like let's let the capitalists run wild. But I do think that you see a lot of instances where neighborhood groups say, well, all of the things that I liked about the development that I moved into, I don't want another development like that.
Yeah.
People in high rises who don't want another high rise built next to their high rise because it cuts off their view.
All right.
Or people in, you know, multifamily developments who don't want apartment buildings because they're worried that that's going to decrease their property values.
I'm curious too about the representation of demographic of these neighborhood associations, with gentrification going crazy, like over the last decade here probably or so, with new people moving to Nashville in these historically, maybe even people of color, black neighborhoods, North Nashville, East Nashville. Neely's Bend is still considered East Nashville for all my Nashville natives who try to put Madison, you know, somewhere else. It's still East Nashville. What are those neighborhood associations? Are they looking like the demographics of those historical families and communities that's always been there, or is that something different?
That's a really great question, Jerome. So there have actually been a lot of studies that have looked at whether neighborhood associations, whether the demographics of those associations actually represent the demographics of the neighborhood that they purport to represent. And long story short, no. Generally speaking, they are whiter, they're more affluent, they're more educated than the neighborhood that they quote unquote represent. And so one example I gave, we don't have any studies like that in Nashville. There was a really interesting study I talked about in New Orleans. But one specific example that I was able to find here in Nashville was in Salem Town. There was a proposal for an affordable housing development for seniors and people with disabilities. And the neighborhood association in Salem Town was opposed because they thought it was too tall. They thought there were too many units. And so they organized and were able to get changes made to the plan that actually reduced the number of affordable housing units. Meanwhile, you had residents from Cheatham Place, which was very nearby.
Across the street.
Yeah, literally.
Literally.
Where the development is now taking place, who were supportive of it because they had received services from the group that is now building the affordable housing development. They've done a lot in the community. And so you had like 40 letters from people at Cheatham Place, which is Nashville, I learned, which is Nashville's oldest public housing development. And then you had folks from Cheatham Place also show up to speak in support of the proposal. And all of the people who showed up to speak in support from Cheatham Place were Black and had lived in Nashville for decades.
Right.
And the Salem Town Neighbors Board is all white, and the longest serving Salem Town neighbor, like the person who'd lived in Salem Town the longest, has only been there since 2016. So you have this group of people who on average had been there like less than 4 years, who don't look like
the neighborhood. They don't look like the community. Yeah,
exactly. And they were able to like reduce the affordable housing units in this proposal.
Right.
So that was kind of illustrative for me.
A question of power too, right?
Yeah, absolutely.
A phrase came up in your cover a lot that I want to say you discussed some with former council member Brett Withers, maybe, no-go zones.
Yeah.
And just like how powerful neighborhood associations can be in establishing those. You mind explaining that a little?
Yeah, sure. So I think if you talk to people who are in neighborhood associations, or maybe even just people who watch development in Nashville, they will probably tell you that developers exert way more influence and have way more power on the planning and zoning and development process than neighborhood groups do. And I think that's an open question. I don't necessarily think there's a way to measure that. But one thing that I did find really interesting is I talked to several council members, former council members, who talked about different neighborhoods that had become quote unquote no-go zones for them, where they weren't even going to bring a rezoning proposal or a development proposal to those neighborhoods because it was such a hassle. They were going to receive so much pushback that it's like not even worth it for the whatever benefit there might be in terms of creating more housing for folks.
Is there specific neighborhoods that you can name?
Yeah, so Edgefield in East Nashville was one that former council member Withers talked about.
Historic Edgefield.
Historic Edgefield, yes. And Green Hills, the Green Hills Neighborhood Association, which formed in response to a development. Okay. And that's what you see, a lot of these neighborhood associations have actually formed in response to a development that comes in and they don't want it. And they're like, well, wait a second, we need to organize because we don't want that to happen again.
Right.
So I think when you look at it in terms of what happens once a development proposal gets to the planning commission or to the council, it may look like developers have a lot more influence. And in some ways they do. Like, they're pretty sophisticated. They can usually afford to hire lawyers and consultants. But in other ways, some proposals never even get to that point because those neighborhoods are just like they've got a no vacancy sign. Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. Do we see a lot of, or has Nashville specifically, at least in recent years, seen a lot of neighborhood associations pushing back in a way that's really been beneficial for the neighborhood, aside from just like sort of preserving the character of the neighborhood?
I think that there have been some proposals, particularly when you've got proposals about like large industrial developments or like dumps. Like, there have been proposals to put dumps like in North Nashville. And you've gotten neighborhood associations to rally around and really like fight those things. And I think when you're talking about proposals that are just like definitely bad for the neighborhood, like by any objective measure, then yeah, you've seen that be a positive. But more often than not, what they're fighting are these one-off developments, like residential developments in particular.
Yeah. I wonder, looking at this article and taking a deep dive in it, what are some of the things you think Nashvillians or just Middle Tennesseans should pull away from it, especially if you're thinking about buying a home, if you can afford one at this particular moment? What are some of the things you think they should be pulling out from this story as they consider home ownership, as they consider, you know, maybe I'm part of a homeowner association. Am I being implicit in some harm, or am I being implicit in more of like helping my community grow? Am I connecting with the historical community that's been here that I just moved here to in 2018 or last year or whatever it may be? Yeah,
I think you can, if you come to it, first of all, from that mindset of being conscious of the fact that you're new here, then I think that's a good place to start.
Yeah.
And you can make change from the inside of an organization. There is a lot to be said for, you know, if you feel like a neighborhood association is not representing what you and your neighbors want your community to look like, if you want to welcome more development, if you want to see more proposals, if you want to see affordable housing and you feel like the neighborhood association has been fighting against that, then the way the system currently functions, the way that council members listen to neighborhoods and neighborhood associations, like it might be important for you to plug in order to try to like change that, like I said, from the inside.
Right. Because I think a lot of people just might not know how. Like,
Yeah.
They feel like, well, my home homeowners association is just too powerful for me to take on or to address. But it's maybe if you can rally some other community members that are like-minded or have the same issues, like maybe there can be something said about that.
There's one source you have in your story I don't want to forget to bring up because I just love his story. Ernest. Will you just tell us about Ernest?
Yeah. Ernest Morgan, he was probably the most fascinating person I spoke to for this story. We talked at a coffee shop for 3 hours, uninterrupted, and I could have kept talking for hours. So he lives in Wedgwood, Houston, and he was trying, like you were saying, trying to plug into the neighborhood association, which in Wedgwood, Houston, it's South Nashville Action People, or SNAP. So he was trying to plug in and was emailing the contact on the website and wasn't getting any response. And he had a lot of experience with neighborhood groups in Minneapolis, which is where he had moved from, and really wanted to get involved. But I mean, these neighborhood associations are made up of volunteers. So sometimes they're not going to get to your email, or they're not even monitoring the email, and they forget about bringing new people in. So he had an unrelated issue, which was that in his front yard, there was a light pole, an NES light pole, that had been sort of cut off halfway up. So it wasn't working. And he couldn't get the city to come remove it. He called and called and called, couldn't get anyone to do anything about it. So he decided to turn it into an art installation.
Oh, wow. That's amazing.
Yeah. So he invited all of the kids in the neighborhood to come, and he bought these directional signs, and they wrote their favorite cities on, and he posted these directional signs on the light pole to really, it's like, it's an eyesore, let's turn it into something beautiful.
Right.
Well, within about a month, the city had caught wind of this and came to remove the light pole. But in the process of getting some press over that, he was actually able to get in touch with the neighborhood association, which reached out to him. And then, you know, a series of events ensued that I will let people read in the piece. But I think it speaks to that idea of, like, sometimes you can be trying really hard to plug in, and existing neighborhood groups might not be focused on bringing those new people in until it just sort of like slaps them in the face.
Right.
Yeah.
Or they could be gatekeeping the neighborhood association.
They could be. Yeah. I mean, there's interestingly, this didn't make it into the piece, but I looked at bylaws for a bunch of neighborhood associations. There was one neighborhood association in Richland, West End. Their bylaws require renters to have lived in that neighborhood for 4 years to become a part of the neighborhood association. That was the only one I found like that. I don't think that that's typical.
Yeah.
And maybe it's not something that they really enforce. But when you have that written into your governing documents, like, you are literally saying, if you don't own a home here, we don't take you seriously.
You don't have a say. You don't have a voice.
Yeah.
Your landlord maybe does.
Yeah, exactly.
Right. Yeah.
These bylaws, thank you very much, by the way, for combing through bylaws of neighborhood associations. That's like true reporting.
I find it fascinating personally.
Thank God for the Nashville scene that you do, Nicole. I appreciate that.
But no, this was amazing. I can't wait till I can read the whole thing and really take a deep dive, and like, I'm learning about this.
Yeah.
And so I appreciate the work that you did and putting this in. I hope the people that's watching and listening And read the
Yes,
issue.
please
Please
read it.
Please
Read it.
We work
Read
really
it.
hard.
We telling you read it on camera
Yes.
now. You have directions. You have an action step. Read it. But that's listening. They really get to hear directly from you. And I think this would kind of make this special too, right? You get to read Nicole's work, but also you get to hear the point of.
One of my favorite parts of the job is just talking stories out with our reporters and learning. And before you go, I do want to dive in just a little bit to the Metro Council because we have a new. Mostly new council. There's a few second-term council members.
About half,
yeah. And Nicole, of course, writes on first reading. I feel like you've been, is it more than 2 years at this point?
Yeah, November of 2021.
So a little past 2 years. Yeah. It's great. I love it because for those of us who try to watch the Metro Council meetings.
Or attend them.
Or some people attend. I mean, God bless them. But... it's hard to keep up with. Even somebody whose work directly relates to it and cares about it, it's kind of tough to get off of work and then queue up the, YouTube link for 3-4 hours, sometimes more.
Yeah.
And so I really appreciate you recap them and you also provide your analysis. So there was a recent Metro Council meeting, one of the first meetings of the new term-ish. We're a few in by this point.
Yeah.
But it was a little tumultuous, I think is a polite word to use.
Yeah, are we allowed to curse on
You can
here?
say whatever you like. Yeah.
I called it a shit show, and I stand by that.
Yeah. Shit show is definitely the right word.
Yeah.
So what was a shit show about it?
Well, I think you saw a lot of people with very strong opinions about legislation that they may or may not have read. And you get into that issue pretty frequently when you have 40 individual council members who are all part-time, most of whom have full-time jobs because they only make $25,000 doing council.
If that.
Yeah. Well, it is.
Yeah, it's 25.
It's,
okay.
Yeah.
They all get the same. Well, the at-larges get a little bit more.
A little bit more.
Yeah.
Okay.
30 or something.
No, not 30.
Oh, not even 30.
It might actually be. I think only the vice mayor.
I'm gonna say
more.
I'm gonna say vice mayor maybe.
But
I don't think it's that much more.
I think they're still all in the 20s.
Yeah.
Anyway, it's not enough. And it's not enough, at least, to, feed yourself on just that salary. So there were quite a few instances of people having really strong opinions that may or may not have been well informed by data. And then there was a whole procedural nightmare around these zoning reforms that Councilmember at Large Quinn Evans Siegel has proposed. She caused quite a stir, and council members trying to kill those before they ever really see the light of day. She was able to get them deferred, but just barely by a 1-vote margin. And people were just up in arms about pretty much everything on Tuesday night. So last Tuesday night. So that was, I encourage everyone to read my column. I got a lot of feedback on it. Some people, I will say, I'm an opinion columnist. Some people don't agree with my opinions. And that is perfectly fine.
As is their right.
Yeah.
It happens sometimes.
But if it causes you to pay attention, to be engaged, and to have some interest in what's going on, I love that.
Yeah.
And that's all I want from anything that I do, is really for people to get engaged. If you have opinions, share them with your council members. You don't have to share them with me. I don't get to vote. But if you've got opinions about legislation, you have a district council member, you have 5 at-large council members. So I always encourage people to make their voice heard.
And I won't put you on the spot by throwing any names out there, but one of my favorite things about your coverage is there might be a council member who sort of just ideologically, philosophically, you don't necessarily agree with, but you're always careful to point out the ones who are doing the work and paying a lot of attention. I know there have been council members who, you might not necessarily agree with how they're, with legislation they're trying to get passed, but they hear from the people in their community, and maybe it is what their community want, their constituents want. And it's always kind of delightful for me to see the folks that you kind of highlight, and you're like, they're doing the work.
Yeah, and that's, I think, important for me to sort of acknowledge my bias, but also to recognize when council members are doing a really good job at being a council member. I think someone we were talking about before we started this was Councilmember Courtney Johnston in the Creve Hall area. She and I don't agree on much of anything politically, but she is so responsive to her constituents. She gets their concerns taken care of. She is well informed about pretty much everything that she speaks about, and she does her homework. And I may not agree with her, but her constituents reelected her, so she's doing something right.
And it's what I was calling the sort of nuts and bolts element of being a council member. Sometimes it's about, of course there are things like big picture things about the goals and priorities of the city, but sometimes it's like, look, we've got like a dangerous intersection in our district. I just want to get somebody to pay attention to that. And sometimes that's, what the job is. And we won't get into maybe slashing the council size because I think maybe some opinions have shifted on that in recent weeks. There has been legislation passed to do that. We'll see where that goes in the future. But for now, we've got 40 council members.
I think that's something to like. If you're watching, listen to this, I think a comment somewhere like, should we slash? Do you want the council to slash
the third biggest council in the country?
We do, and we don't have the third biggest city.
That's right. Not even close.
Yeah. We're not, Houston or New York City or anything, so I'm not sure we need 40 people. But well, thank you very much, Nicole.
Appreciate you.
Thank you.
Loved editing your story. Loved reading your story. I'm so grateful that you had your first cover story for us. I hope it's the first of many.
Thank you so much.
Congratulations.
Thank you very much, Jerome.
We did it. The first one.
First episode.
The first one.
It's like we were
the first one. We
right?
did it. We did.